Joe Chiccarelli here. We're here today with Joe Barresi, legendary producer, the man who is all about guitars in my book. Tool, Soundgarden, Slipknot, Weezer, Avenged Sevenfold, it just goes on. I mean, this is the wizard of big rock. Welcome, Joe Barresi.
Thank you, Joe. That's very nice. I'm a legend on my block, but that's about it.
In Pasadena.
all my neighbors know me as the guy who taught them how to play Guitar Hero. I used to teach people how to play guitar, and now I do Guitar Hero.
Excellent. I gotta ask you, today's question, I gotta ask you about Pinkerton. Everybody always wants to know about Pinkerton. It's the legendary Weezer album. And I don't know if you know my history with Weezer. You know that I got a demo tape. I'll give you the long story because you probably don't know it.
I don't.
And it'll be fun. And you can edit this through however you want. So somewhere 92, 93, I was working on a project over at Master Control. You remember Master Control in Burbank?
Yeah, Aisley.
You remember the Recycler, which was a free ad newspaper.
It was Craigslist on
I
paper.
was selling some Anvil cases through the Recycler, and this guy calls me and says, I want to buy some of these cases. Comes down to the studio and says, I'll buy these two from you. And he said, oh, you're a producer? I have a cassette here of my band's demos. Would you listen to them? And I was like, sure, of course. So take the cassette from him. And it's Matt Sharp, okay?
Oh, shit, that's
the bass
funny.
player.
Yeah.
So I take the cassette, and for some reason, I don't listen to it right away. I put it in my car in the side compartment, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, I'm going Saturday morning, going to the car wash and cleaning out stuff to go to the car wash, and I find the cassette, and I'm like, oh, I should listen to this. He was a nice guy, you know? I put the cassette in. First song is Jonas.
Oh, shit.
Then Say It Ain't So, Sweater Song. And I instantly get the phone, and because it was the days of car phones, and I call Matt, and I'm like, hey, your band is great. I love these songs. You know, what are you guys all about? What are you doing? And he said, well, we have a rehearsal house that we all live at in West LA. You know, why don't you come over to the house? So I go to their place. They're all living in this house together in West LA. Anyways, long story short, they were playing around town. I helped them get to record companies. I got them to Elektra, to Interscope, to Capitol, to a bunch of labels. Everybody passed on them. Everybody said, I don't know about the songs. I don't know. You know, the vocals aren't that great. You know, the harmonies are really out of tune. So for about 6 months or so, I tried to shop the band. Maybe it was longer than that. Couldn't. Restless, actually, Restless Records, which was Enigma Records, was Bill Hine was one of the first people that was into the band, but they were a small label.
Right, so it's the indie that has the taste and the foresight to go, this is great.
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden the major label sniffs it and says, oh.
And the minute Todd Sullivan was the first real record label that came and saw him and got it. And then, as you know, eventually they signed to Todd at Geffen. But the guys were great in that they took care of me. They gave me a finder's fee and everything.
That's awesome.
You know, Todd got involved, and then he got Rick Ocasek involved, and the rest is history. You know, but segue to second album, Pinkerton, which is one of the ones that really stands the test of time. And you were a major part of that. And I mean, I still hear El Scorcho all the time on the radio.
Oh, yeah.
And from that opening guitar tone, whatever that is, like clean guitars, double tracked or whatever, it just like, you instantly are like, I'll listen to this. This has got a character. This has got a sound. This has got a personality. Like, what did you do? How did you get that guitar sound? What is that album all about? Tell us about it.
All right, well, Todd Sullivan actually called me and said, we're going to make another record. And this is after the Blue album, which is monumental. And he said, we want you to remix Say It Ain't So, because they had taken all the feedback out of it. It muted all the feedback. So you'll hear it on the radio sometimes. There's no feedback in the down, like in the chorus parts. So I was going to Electric Lady to remix that. And the whole time thinking, why don't they just get Chris Shaw to do it? Because he mixed the album and it sounds incredible. So they did get Chris Shaw to do it, and so I started Pinkerton next door while Chris was remixing
Wow.
Say It Ain't So. So that the one thing they said was the band hated to use headphones. So we're at Electric Lady, and I set it up so that they played live. Was they're a great band, they could totally play live.
Yep.
And we used wedges, and they had the self cues, but the self cues powered wedges, so the whole room was basically on, blowing up. At the time, it was 4 guys, and Matt Sharp, as you know, has an insane bass sound. He's using orange heads and cabinets that were so loud. And Brian was playing a Travis Bean, and Rivers. I don't remember honestly what guitar Rivers had at the time. It was some sort of Stratty with a humbucker.
Right.
We had a 30th anniversary Marshall in there and a Plexi 50 watt, and it was basically live. Everything about it was live. And the thing that I couldn't get past was trying to tie it all together in the room because it was so blown out, and the Blue record was not really blown out. And so I, knowing Jason Casaro and him being a mentor and him working with Eddie Martinez, a great guitar player, I always loved Eddie's sounds and Robert Palmer and the stuff he did there. So we went to visit Eddie one day, and I asked Eddie about his guitar sound, and he said, I used to use these Electro-Harmonix linear power boosters.
Oh yeah,
the little ones you plug into your LPB ones. You plug them into your guitar. And he rack mounted them because they were so bad, running around on stage, that he puts them in the rack. And he goes, I got a bunch of them here. Do you want to take a few and try them out? So he gave me a shoebox full of old LPB ones that were half broken, and I cobbled a couple together. And when I got there, I actually I had a pair of M49s on the room of the band live, and I put the LPB ones on the room sound.
What?
I blew up the $20,000 tube mics with a $20 LPB one, and that was the room sound that created the bombasticness of that band playing live.
Because it does have such a dark, dirty tone compared to the first record. And I remember talking to Rivers about it after, and Chris Shaw as well, and they told me that Rick's whole thing was, I want to say it was a Mesa Boogie amp, but I might be wrong about that. But basically small amps turned down really low, really very little SPL, crank the preamp, get the distortion there, and very little SPL, so the speaker isn't really pushing a lot of air, which means you turn the mic preamp up, and of course everything comes up to your face and feels like a really huge guitar sound. So they really went from
I went the other way.
A whole other way.
Yeah, I was like, how do you make this? There were other things happening at the time within the band, and Matt had the rentals as well, and he was just got a deal on Maverick, so he was in that area, and Brian had just come into the band, and so together as a team to make it cohesive in Electric Lady, which kind of, the way people tell me that the sound of the room changed every day because there was water going
humidity.
Underneath there.
Yes, the river. There's a river that runs underneath. Back in the bass amp closet there, we used to always put the B15 or whatever you put the bass, whatever kind of bass amp it was, you put it in this closet in the back of the room. And the New York City River ran under that and would flood sometimes. And I remember working in there where you would come in the morning and the bass amp would be soaking wet.
I just put them all in the same room. They just wanted to hear each other, and to get that cohesiveness to gel, the only way I could do it was to blow up the room a little bit, and it came down to Eddie Martinez's LPB ones, and there's so much live on that record, and at some point, I mean, he's going past the guitar sound at this point, but it was two Marshalls, a 30th anniversary for Rivers, and a 50-watt Plexi reissue JMP for Brian. And Matt's Orange, which I still try to buy to this day because it sounded so good.
Really?
And they were just on power amp distortions blowing up in that room with the M49s on stun and cut live to tape. and then some tape editing going on between takes, and there was actually so many songs, it was insane. And Rivers is a great soloist, and
Yes.
Brian's a great guitar player, has some very unique styles together, so that worked. And Matt just hunkering it all down, and Pat, obviously Pat's
Do you remember anything specifically about El Scorcho or Tired of Sex or any of the specific songs?
I remember just asking, like, a lot of times your engineer mind goes, that drum kit is not tuned as well as it can be, you know, like you're hitting that floor tom and it's howling. And I'm like, it's just obvious when you're tight mic'd. So you push the mics away, and that's where you go. That's where the mentality for me came about, just trying to capture the big picture room. Because when you hit that floor tom now, it doesn't quite howl as much and sound like it's pitching down.
Yes, yes.
But when you do hit that first drum fill, you go, this is a unique drum sound, which, you know, if you can't beat them, you join them. And they loved, at the time, they were bringing up some references. Like, this is where Dave Fridman ended up coming back into the picture. They love Flaming Lips, and they loved the band Hum. Keith Cleversley, I think, is the guy. And they would bring me stuff like that, which was Vaseline from STP a little bit later on. You're just like, okay, this is not your normal Blue Record hi-fi rock sound.
The drums are all taped up and dead, and point sources. The snare, really, it sounds pretty natural to me, but it's definitely brighter and ringier, crisper overall than the previous record, and actually from what they would do after that. I mean, that record really stands alone in the catalog.
It kind of went back to Rick on the Green album. And I think Tom Lord Alge mixed it, and we added some keyboard stuff. I mean, the tapes came in, but we ended up doing keyboard overdubs after he mixed it. I think it was crazy. But I think no one knew at the time that it might be the predecessor to what would be called emo, you know, which people tell me that that's their reference. I mean, I listened to the Blue record and go, this sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I like Pinkerton as well because of the involvement, but it was really like a very unorthodox method of everything to the...
You probably haven't done a record like that since then, have you?
No, not like that. And there was points...
When you do Bad Religion, do you do that stuff live?
Some of it was cut live. Yeah. I mean, the one thing about working today is everything's kind of pieced together, and you never really know what things are going to sound like until you get to the mix stage, you know. But back then...
Not me.
Oh, yeah, you knew the... Well, I'll tell you one interesting story about that record was at one point we were working at Fort Apache, and because it was live, you know, they wanted to change a note on the guitar, but the bass was already done and Matt wasn't around. So that we could easily change the note on the bass, but the note on the bass is in the room. So I literally was using an H3000. I was calling it Joe Tools, and I was sampling the room and pitching it to the correct note and flying it in, punching it in like two-handed.
And this is analog tape.
Analog tape. So as the tape went by, I could pitch Matt's bass to like an A to an A sharp or whatever. But I'd also have to pitch the room because it would still sound out of tune until I pitched anything that the bass was bleeding through, which is pretty much everything at that point.
It is pretty amazing when you think of, you know, sort of how crude our tools were then. And, you know, it was the harmonizer that you tuned a voice.
Yeah.
You know, somebody went a little bit sharp, you patched it in the harmonizer, and when the note came along, you just went...
And no one really cared, you know. I mean, a little bit out of tune here and there was actually good.
Yeah, it was exciting.
It was real.
Yeah.
You know, I love 70s records that are... To me, they're maybe a little bit sharp because they speed them up to get through the radios and get that commercial in there and that excitement of being slightly sharp. Why not? As long as everybody tunes at the same note, who cares?
Oh, you're right. It gives things an edge.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are we doing?
That's a good spot. We should move to Barresi now.
Okay. Can I get one more in? And I mean...
We can go for 30 minutes.
Well, no, I mean, how's your time?
I'm good, yeah. I just need to double check that phone for a second in case.
Yeah.
I got dudes that are... Yeah, no, it's...
Because I was going to do a Queen's question.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely. No, that's the great thing, because also I don't want to overstep the flow, because Nico or Bob or Greg or whoever might really get into something.
No, and this is
Thank you.
the live approach to that record and using those horrible little
I know. I'm
amps.
like you would never. Like I literally felt embarrassed. I'm looking at this and like the first time I've ever seen an M49 in my life and use a microphone that cost, more money than my car, and I'm putting it through a $20 guitar,
which were
distortion
just
box.
they were almost like super hard-ons or
They
something.
were there,
right?
yeah. They were preamps, so
Yeah.
a little transistor in there, and basically you plug it in your guitar. Or if you were really like tech savvy, you could reverse wire it so you can put it in your amp, so you don't have to carry it on your guitar. But Eddie just had them rack mounted because he had too many issues with him, and he had a rack full of them already. So he gave me all the leftovers, and I was able to put two
Because that
together.
era of electro-harmonic stuff, everything always broke. I mean,
well,
you
it's just-
stepped on a
yeah.
big muffin, it fell
Yeah,
apart.
yeah. And these things were just terrible. So, but there's the sound of Pinkerton right there, $40.
It's brilliant. Just brilliant. I love it. Well, all right.
Let's start it off.
Joe's here. We got to talk about Queens of the Stone Age. It's just like one of my favorite all-time acts. And
Awesome.
you were there from the very beginning. I mean, my sort of love affair with them goes back to Caius days,
Yeah.
when our probably mutual friend Kathy Ennie was
Yeah.
managing them. And actually, you go back to Fu Manchu days.
I did 3 Caius records.
Yes,
actually,
I know. And Kathy was always turning me on to him, and I just thought, like, this band is so cool, and nothing ever happened. It was this cult thing. At the time, it was almost like it didn't fit in with the times. It was ahead of the times in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, they went on tour with Metallica and then and White Zombie, and then all of a sudden, they were touting this band as genius because they were a great band.
Yeah, they were really
But,
forging their own sound.
yeah, and it started out in the desert with the the generator parties, and
Right.
so then they would just, where do you play in the desert? You get a generator, you set up in an empty swimming pool, and you have a party, and there you go. So that's where it came from. But
now you did the very first record.
did the first record,
And then you did
Lullabies.
Lullabies to Paralyze, right?
yeah, and then some of Era Vulgaris and
Right.
a couple songs on Like Clockwork as well.
Wow.
It's been a long history. but-
Amazing, long history. So my question for you is, it's guitars again, because I'm always just, tweaking guitars and moving mics and trying different amps and different guitars, just like you are. And the Queens of the Stone Age guitar sound is a very unique thing. I mean, it's almost like it's a specific tone that really no one else uses. And for me, the sort of evolution of it is really interesting, because when you listen to the very first Queens record, the guitar tones feel pretty normal, martially rock guitar sounds. By the time you get to Lullabies, there's that Josh thing that to my ear always sounds like neck pickup, rolled off tone, maybe fuzz box or old Supro amp or whatever it is. I'm sure I'm making it more exotic than it really is, but it's a very unique tone. So I'm really curious what that is. I really want to know what that tone is, but I'm also curious like how it came about.
All right. Well, okay. This will be. First of all, we'll just assume that Josh Homme is a great guitar player, because he
Yes.
is, and he has
Amazing.
a unique identity, and the way he plays in C and up the neck, and with Ovation guitars at the time, and stuff that no one used because he wanted to be different. So
They were all old Ovation Electrics, which were weird
weird
horrible
guitars.
guitars, yeah.
And then later on, he would get stuff made by Mayton, Australian company. But
Yep.
he was always into unique stuff anyway. And his, so I'll tell you kind of a funny story. When we were making, I made Blues for the Red Sun, Sky Valley, and Circus. I remember trying to get guitar sounds with Caius and thinking about the normal coming up through the Keith Olsons and Mike Stones and those guys where the mics were on the cabinets, and Josh never quite being happy, and Chris Goss, who produced Caius, never quite being happy with the guitar sound. And then putting an 87 up on a stand, much like this 414 is, and trying to dial in something, and then all of a sudden it came together. And I don't know if it was a combination of EQ or what was happening, and then I went out and looked, and the mic had fallen on the stand. And it fell in a way where it was a little further back and a little more off axis. So it wasn't an immediate guitar sound. So the Caius guitar sound is purely accidental in that respect, where I didn't quite capture it until the stand, being faulty, had fallen. So that's where it all started. And
planned accident method. That's
there you go.
What Neil Giraldo would always call it, because it's those happy accidents that just magically happen in a studio that really turn into a sound.
Yeah, I couldn't get what he was trying to convey to me until that happened, and then I heard what he liked. And then I go, oh, we can do it like this. Let's shift the mic a little bit here, or try, but at that point I knew back off axis and a little bit more room. I mean, Sound City, we used to record in corridors and stuff, so there wasn't much room, but there were places that were reflective, and that helped. So it wasn't a matter of like, now sometimes I'll foam things out to make it super tight when you're playing drop A rhythms that are really tight. You want to get that really close, tight guitar sound, but with him it's more of an open, and reflections help. Like a lot of times I always laugh at live, you used to see 58s hanging on an amp where it's facing the ground.
That was the Jeff Beck guitar sound. That's what Dave Jordan told me, that he was working with Jeff Beck and things weren't going well. Jeff wasn't really happy with the guitar tone at all, and said just that. Like, when I play live, it's always great sounding. I don't know why we can't get that. And Dave said he went over and dangled a 57 in front of the amp,
speaker.
dangled it down over the speaker, just like that. And the minute Jeff heard that, he was like,
there it is.
There it is. There's my sound.
Off axis, facing the ground. I mean, that is the one thing that I will say, you never know. So moving a microphone was the art. Just like picking the cartridge for your turntable, and now you kind of tend to see a lot more post EQing compression going on when it really came down to picking the right microphone.
Yep.
Anyway, long story longer, first Queen's record, at one point Josh was playing the bass and the guitar. So that's part of that guitar sound as well. Also, the bass amp had died, and at that point I was really into reamping through a Sovtek MiG 50, which I still do to this day.
Yeah, I love those amps.
So I use that, which is a Russian bassman, and I was reamping through that in a ghetto reamp, because there was no reamp at that point either. I was just using, you turn the fader down, or you go into a compressor 1-to-1 and turn the output down. So you get all that weird impedance stuff happening, put it in the amp, it's already volatile at that point, so that bass sound gelling with his guitar sound, which was fairly interesting stuff back then.
So the kind of doubling in octaves thing gives it a lot of the
with
character.
One guy playing it too. It's
Exactly,
almost like
same
the
feel.
same feel, the
tightness.
same exactly like when you get a drummer who's a singer. It's always that kind of tight rhythm that happens. So we had that going, and he was using some TubeWorks stuff at the time, which was unique. TubeWorks DIs. It wasn't until like
the yellow face.
Yeah,
I remember that. It wasn't really that great.
No, it was interesting though, and it was stuff that I'd never seen before, and also it was sort of how he played in Caius. We were sometimes playing through SVTs, which I would never think about, on a guitar, but it is a very loud, clean. It's the biggest pedal platform amp you would ever want at this point. So, so part of that was into the equation.
And then where did it go from that first album to Lullabies?
To Lullabies, it went to... So Lullabies was interesting in the fact that the songs were kind of getting written and recorded live, and we would spend more time getting the sound of the song together, and then they would just play it. So it was completely live, and a lot of times they would trade instruments. So Alan Johannes would play guitar or bass, and then Troy Van Leeuwen would play guitar or bass, and Josh would play, and sometimes it was maybe make the song a little more like a circus. So put them in a circle and kind of use small amps all facing each other, so you get that leakage. I remember there was stuff where we did a lot of guitar swells where Josh and Troy would play together, and I'd put the 2 amps in the middle of the Sound City and face them opposite, and then I'd mic them from the corners. And so Josh would be coming out of the left side, but I would use the panning of this right microphone to create some of the swell, and the right guitar amp would be Troy's, and it would be in this right speaker, but the left echo from here, and cutting it live helped as well. It was actually the first time that we got into using multiple amps with Josh too at the same time. So,
and mostly small amps.
Mostly small amps, but it could be anything from a Bassman with 212s. They were really into Ampegs at the time when Rod Stewart's backline was for sale at Guitar
old
Center.
Geminis and Rockets and stuff like that?
More like VT22s and V4s and V40, VT40s, and like serious like 410s and 212s, the Ampegs with the 7027 tube also at that point, which you couldn't even find. So you were using an amp that had a unique reverb. Love the spring reverb in those amps, and unique power tubes, so there's a uniqueness as well. And then coupled with some interesting pedal choices, more of the Foxes, like Fox Tone Machines, and the super like Little Sister, that octavey kind of thing.
Yeah.
It might actually be a H homebrew UFO pedal, because that was kind of unique at the time. Like Joey Castillo that was the first record I have personally done where we overdubbed the cymbals. So we cut the drums in two
nice and
sections,
tight.
yeah, and also allowed you to make a room sound that was a little more defined and less splashy. So that's part of the picture as well. But there was like a plexiglass 412 cabinet that they got from Prince that we used, which didn't sound great but sounded unique. There was, Josh was really into little Gibson amps at that time as well, but I was really into Watkins amps at that point.
I love Watkins.
So we had
Westminsters,
Dominators, Jokers, all kinds of stuff, Scouts.
Yeah. Blackbird in Nashville has 3 or 4 classic early 60s Watkins that we used on White Stripes, Raconteurs, My Morning Jacket. They have such a unique sound, and it's
his echo in front of those. So it's a tube, basically it's a tube English Echoplex, a Watkins copycat, but maybe sometimes never using the echo part, just using the tube front end as a preamp, which all the guys back in the day, like that I grew up listening to, like the Jimmy Pages and the Richie Blackmores, they always needed to, if Richie Blackmore had a 200 watt Marshall Major and needed something, Tony Iommi always used to preamp his Laneys because they were so loud and clean. So you can put everything from a turntable.
Blow up the front end.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Watkins copycat in front of those amps gave it an extra dimension of push, which was incredible. So that was really the multiple miking of amps and blending them. So we did the same thing with the vocals on that record. The David Bowie thing, when you always read about singing louder.
Distance, right.
Right. So mine was a little more ghetto. It was more like a condenser and a dynamic going through 2 different chains, blow it up, but then a little ambient mic, and the stuff that we all do now, but back then was more interesting. Doing it to a tape machine, committing to it, and putting it on 24 tracks was a whole nother beast.
Yeah, that's the thing, is committing. That's what I find really made a difference with a lot of records. We were talking about Roy Thomas Baker earlier, and Roy was just brilliant at, overloading the console for the drums or the guitar, whatever it was, and that was the sound, and he committed to it and built the rest of the record around it. So like you were saying, it's the combination of all those pieces that gives it its unique personality.
People always say, wow, how did you get that guitar sound? It's super heavy. And I'm thinking, it's not really that heavy. It's the bass underneath it. Or sometimes it's the guitar underneath the bass, which totally changes people's perspective because they never think about the bass being above it. But I read somewhere, I think maybe Rich Costey said you can never have too much treble on a bass, and it's true. I mean that.
Oh, me, I'm always like, just spinning stuff out of control, plug-in after plug-in, going, I can't get this to cut through, and he's right. Like, you, no matter what you do, and you turn it louder, and it's
it's that cut of having the bass appear heavier, and the guitar appears heavier, because it is a cohesive, pair of instruments that are creating that weight, but it really is sometimes the guitar is lower And, just the odd mic choice. I could tell you first Queen's record, I decided to make the band, because they didn't have a deal at the time. I wanted it to sound unique. So part of it was not mixing it on normal speakers. It was a pair of EV Sentries.
Oh my God.
Right, which are horrible. But when you make them sound good, you have a record that sounds totally different.
Yes.
So by not making the same speaker choices as everybody else, I had a record that sounded different.
It's really smart.
So that was a very conscientious decision to do, because they had those speakers in the desert and the 3M tape machine at the time, which is a nightmare to keep in speed. So you have some of that fluctuation going on too, where you can hear it on the beginning of Avon and stuff. And I mean, those were fun times, and fast too, just exciting. Keep it fast, not overanalyzing everything.
Yeah, ultimately, when I really look back, some of the best records are ones that were made really quickly. Everybody always talks about the first Cars album, that Roy said that he did the whole album top to bottom in something like 17 days, I think it was.
First Queen's record was 17 days.
Yeah.
And it was mostly Calrec mic pre's.
Wow.
Because the studio had a Soundtracks console, and I knew I was going to mix it with some automation, so I put the automation, it was J.L. Cooper automation, on 16 channels, so I inserted it while I was getting sounds. That way I knew I would hear what that VCAs are doing while I'm doing it. Otherwise, I knew it'd get the sound and it would change it. So might as well just go all the way at that point. So if you push it up, it might not be the greatest sound in the world, but together,
you know what you're getting.
Yeah, it works. So
yeah, and that's, I mean, we can go on forever, but the next point is, in fact, Paterno. This is a good one to talk about. Paterno is John, yeah, I think it was John. Anyways, the thing is, I always look at this like you're always mixing. For me, the day I enter the rehearsal room with the band, I'm mixing.
Right.
The day I start thinking like, maybe you should play this part in this octave here instead of here, or maybe you should take the third out and play it really simple power chords and leave room for this. So I'm really thinking about the end product, just like you were saying, down to the
you're a great
VCAs.
mixer. That's the key, I think, right there, because you know how it's going to fit together later. You see it as the prize already put together, and that's what separates you. I think that to me, and maybe I can ask you this question. This is one of many questions I have for you, but working on so many different kinds of music, how do you put it all together like that? Like, and I could see you probably, what you just said, you see it as the mix from the beginning, so but maybe you can elaborate a little on, like, how do you go from Zappa to Beck to Alanis Morissette to Etta James to Michael Bublé? To me, that is like a talent in itself, to take all that and to retain their identity, but still the same person piloting the ship. How do you put it together in your mind?
Wow, that's a good question, but I really do think of it that way. I really do think of like the big picture, the end product, that final painting. What is it going to look like? And I also really try to be respectful and honorable about the artist and think about, well, what makes this artist great and unique and separate from other artists, and what's their identity? How can I, as the producer, how can I take them perhaps in a little newer direction, something fresh, but still maintain everything that their fans love about them,
right,
and what I love about them as a fan. Because usually when you get into a project, you're really there because you're a fan, whether it's you're hearing a demo of a band that's never been recorded before, or perhaps it's a band you've worked with before, or you love it and you take it on like this. You're this protector, you're gonna like make them as great as they can ever be, because you want to be you want to listen to it yourself. You want to be proud of it for their fans. You want to turn your friends on to it.
Right,
And
right.
so
You love the music.
you just love the music.
That's where
bottom
it
line.
starts,
Yeah.
right there.
So I think there's part of it. And I definitely really think about it. How can this record be unique? And sometimes it's like you were talking about earlier with Queens, choosing the instruments and using unusual instruments and saying, you know, okay, last album you did everything with high gain amps. This record, let's not do that. Let's try to dial it back a little bit. Or this last album, you know, was bone dry. Let's go really atmospheric with this one and see if we can find a balance where it still sounds like you, but it pushes the envelope and gives it a little bit of character. So yeah, I always really think many steps down the line. So I mean that when I get into rehearsal, I'm thinking about the mix. And when I get into tracking, I'm really aiming for the mix. I'm trying to get my sounds. And like, you know, you and I grew up on analog tape.
Yeah.
So we had to get our sounds. If when I was engineering and the producer walked in the room while I was tracking the record, and it didn't sound like it was on the radio already, if it didn't sound like a finished mix, then you were fired. You didn't get the gig. I mean, you really had to make it sound like the radio. It had to sound like the end product. Like, you know, I'm sure you had the experience of walking in on an Al Schmitt session or a Phil Ramone session, and you heard it and you were like, it sounds done. I don't understand this. It sounds mixed. It's done. They're tracking.
And then you look at the console and there's hardly anything going on, and you're like, well, the art was setting it up and picking the right microphones. And I know, but you mentioned something about pre-pro where you're saying take out the third and stuff like that. Like those things, to me, I think that probably comes from being a mixer and just knowing this is going to be an issue later. I can make that up in the keyboard, or maybe, you know, things like that maybe some guys that do engineer aren't as focused on, because you're mixing from the beginning and it's thought about it like that. I think what leads me into another question about you have a vocal plugin that just came out that I've messed with and love, and I use all your presets.
That's amazing.
Because I love the 2016, and when I put it up, you're the guy I go to, and I put up the 949s and the Eventide stuff, I go right to you instantly, and if you're in the list, I always start there, because I know how great of an engineer and producer you are, mixer. And so, like, how did you develop a point where you're using parallel compression? You worked with some amazing singers. Like, how do you go from an Etta James to a Morrissey or an Alanis or, you know, whoever, Jack White, you know, and to go, this is the mic I'm going to use? Do you audition a bunch of mics?
I used to drive artists crazy, and that when it was time for vocals, I would put up a dozen mics and have them go through them all. And usually, you know, you've done the process. Yeah. You find 2 or 3 that really do something special. But years and years ago, Shelley Yakis, who was a good friend of ours, was really a mentor. And Shelley really kind of gave me one of my early breaks in the business, working with Jimmy Iovine. And he was just absolutely brilliant. But Shelley told me what he called the complementary rule of vocal microphones, which is simply that you find a microphone that sort of fills in the missing pieces of a singer's tone. That every singer, I mean, that's the fun thing about doing vocals, that every singer is different. Yeah. And every singer approaches it different, sounds different. So it's not like miking a guitar. You know, you can narrow it down to a few microphones in a few places and come up with something pretty good almost all the time. But every singer is different. And Shelley's rule was that you kind of analyze the singer's voice. And, you know, I might do that in the club when I'm watching the band before I start the production, or I might do that in rehearsal. I start to get to know their voice and where their peaks are and what they sound like in certain keys and what range they have, and you start to think about their strengths and weaknesses. But you think about if you have a singer that has a very peaky mid-range voice, then you really can't put a microphone that's got a lot of mid-range. So you've got to kind of avoid the Neumanns or something that might be mid-rangey. So maybe you find something that's softer in the mid-range, like a Sony C37 or a RE20 or whatever might be the right choice. So you think of something that sort of fills in all those pieces and gives you this full-bodied, warm vocal sound. So that's kind of where I start. Excuse me. That's kind of where I start with picking a microphone. Like in the case of Etta, she had such a big, bold, brassy voice that we always used an M49, which was always warm and chesty and not too aggressive in the upper mid-range. It just had a way of kind of letting her be powerful and just kind of soften those edges a little bit, but not wimp it out too much, you know? So you found something that just complemented the voice in the right way.
I mean, that there is an art to that too. Just sometimes the singer needs to see the mic. You know, that's another one where you're just like, I can compromise the sound a little bit because the performance is better. But it seems to me like especially after going through your plugin too, the amount of thought that goes behind the vocal sound. And then, just like how do you really like to me, just that the art of making the vocal work. It probably is because you're a great mixer as well, because you're probably hearing how it's going to cut through the rest of the band as well. So complementing the vocal, but still how it works in the big picture.
That's a really, really good point. Like getting the spot in the record where the voice shines through. And that even goes back again to arrangements where, you know, like, oh, if you move the guitar part away from the vocal, or, you know, don't play the melody on top of the vocal, or whatever those things are that are crowding the vocal, or, hey, you know, what if you, move the melody down in this section, basically sing the harmony in this spot, it'll get out of the way of all those high guitar lines, or you know, it is finding that home. I remember years and years ago, probably when it first hit me, is when I first started engineering. I worked on a Rita Coolidge album with David Anderle, who was head of A&R for A&M for years. He was a brilliant guy, really gave me my start as an engineer and producer, really was wonderful to me. And Rita, who had this gorgeous voice, like really husky, deep voice, like Dusty Springfield, but like down an octave or something, like just so rich and so bold. But the amazing thing was that if you tuned the snare drum too low and too thick, it was right in the range of her voice. And every backbeat would kind of like push her out of the way. So you had to find a snare drum tuning and a snare drum sound that didn't bite her voice. Wow. It was crazy.
That is amazing.
I mean, that's probably the first time that really, really hit me about like everything is competition in some ways for the vocal, and how do you make it as important as it needs to be, but get out of the way of the vocal.
Right. Wow. I mean, that's a heavy concept, actually, is to think about the snare affecting the vocal, but you always think about they're in the middle usually. Exactly. So they are in competition with each other.
Right.
And if they're both in the same area, you're not going to be able to change her voice. You're not going to make her sing, you know, for the most part, differently because the snare sounds good.
Yeah. Or every once in a while you get those songs where there's a open hi-hat when somebody is singing an S. And so you get a hi-hat and an S at the same time.
Super
It's just
sibilant. You're like, where is that coming from? And you're de-essing everything, and you're like, yeah. Well, all right, I have my guitar question, if that's cool. 1980, 1981, song comes on the radio. It has this incredible, ominous intro and some unique sounds. And then this guitar comes in and it goes, conk, 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 conk. Canadian band called Red Rider, Lunatic Fringe. What can you tell me about that guitar sound and how you piece that song together? Because there's some really great sounds on that song.
Wow. That was a really fun record. In fact, it's probably maybe like the third album or something I ever engineered in my life, fourth album, something like that. There was a producer that I started working with at Capitol called Richard Landis, and he said, I got this band from Canada I'm going to do, and they had one album out before that did okay, did I think pretty well in Canada, but nothing really clicked in the States. And anyway, in fact, we tracked some of that record right here in this room at Sunset Sound. Some of the tracks were done here, and then we overdubbed it at the old Location Recorders in Burbank, Michael Verdig's place. But the band itself really had a character. Kenny Greer, the guitar player, was really great. Played all that lap steel and pedal
solo
steel on there that was through effects. He was doing the kind of affected pedal steel way before Lanois and Edge and all those people who were doing that. Tons of echoplexes and distortion boxes. The intro to that song is Peter Wolf, who I had worked with previously with Frank Zappa. Peter Wolf, not the Jay Giles Peter Wolf. Peter Wolf, the studio musician who turned producer, went on to produce Jefferson Starship and a bunch of other things, Wang Chung, I think. But Peter loved his Oberheims, and there was some Prophet 5 in there, but a lot of those tones, especially those big kind of belly, bassy, deep tones that sort of almost sound like whales in the ocean.
Yeah, that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, that was Peter. Really, he came up with that whole intro, that thing that just sort of morphs into the band before the big, I think it was just Les Paul or maybe 335 into, it might have just been, at the time, I know I was way into Princeton reverbs. We're talking old school 60s Princeton reverbs that had that throaty, mid-rangey thing. So it could have been a Princeton or maybe a Deluxe, but I don't believe that particular guitar was a high gain Marshall or anything.
It sounds
smaller.
So heavy. That the part is like one chord.
Exactly.
But the attack of it and the space behind it is what made me think about it, because at the time I was really into Van Halen. So you're hearing more busy stuff and a great guitar sound as well, but more saturated.
Right.
And then that comes out and has all this power, almost like the first time you heard
Kurt Cobain.
In the Days of My Youth. It was in Jimmy Page
doing
whatever song that is. Anyway, at this point. But that guitar sound, so was there a real room behind it? Do you remember? It was a room big that it was recorded in?
At the time, I know I was into using 57s straight on the cone, 421 at an angle, and then a 67 with a pad in it back 3 feet or so. And the interesting thing is, when you were talking about the microphone that was in the wrong place, even when you put the large diaphragm condenser back from the amp, it's still always a little phasey. Yeah. And even, especially, no matter how many times you move it back and forth from the close mics, the phase is never, ever right. So you get it in a place where it just does a thing. It just does a character. There's enough honk, And there is something about the sound of a microphone 3 feet back from an amp that it does sound pretty natural. It does sound like what the guitar sounds like in the room, where obviously half an inch away from the cone, it's powerful and impactful, but not real.
Yeah, it's more abrasive and upfront, and you, depending on the band, a lot of times that works. But when you listen to Back in Black, I can imagine there must have been something
Had
3 or 4 feet back too,
Exactly.
because the guitar sounds are big, but there's only
throaty
2.
and real, yeah.
Yeah, there's Angus and Malcolm. You're done. It's so using that ambient mic. I always wonder because I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it again today.
Funny.
But when it came
I'll
on
tell
the
you one
radio,
funny
it
thing.
blew my mind as being so different. And that's what made me want to listen to it. There wasn't a video that I was watching now, that makes me want to watch it or listen to it because I'm watching videos. It came on the radio and I just thought, what is going on here? The setup and the uniqueness of that guitar sound at the time was incredible. So
It was a fun record to make. I remember having a great time. The one funny thing I remember is when we were mixing, we mixed over at Village on a 8108 they had in Studio B at Village. And the song was pretty long. When it first started out, it could have been 6-7 minutes. And even as it exists now, it's probably 4 to 5. I'm
I
not
think
really
it's pretty
sure.
long.
But it's pretty long. And I remember the afternoon we finished the mixing, we had to edit out some of it. And so the first thing, we maybe cut some of the intro, maybe re-intro, but the big thing that we cut was that whole out vamp, where it repeats that bom, 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 bom. Yeah, that big phrase. And
so good.
I remember, I think I was tired, it was a long day of mixing, whatever time it was, and I'm cutting up the end. And you know how with tape editing, you always make a mistake, and you try to mark your pieces and tack them on something to not lose them. But I'm cutting out a bar here, bar there, and by accident, I cut one bar, but I only cut it 2 beats of it out, and I thought I was cutting out a whole bar, but I just cut 2 beats of it. So all of a sudden, in the middle of that outro, there's a bar of 6.
That's where it turns around.
It turns around.
It's so awesome.
It was just another accident, the planned
love
accident method, where it just becomes like a hook.
I love it. That's so awesome because I always try to get drummers to turn the beat around at some point because listening to John Bonham, you're like, can you swap the kick and snare for me, please? And it goes right by them. But that is awesome.
Yeah, pretty funny. So my mistake.
Well, it's still one of those guitar sounds I remember to this day. And, a lot of times you romanticize this guitar sound or something from back in the day, and then you put it on, you're like, this sounds terrible. That thing still sounds incredible.
Wow, I'm gonna have to listen to it now.
I always reference it when I have like the perfect amount of ambience behind a guitar hit by itself because it just sounds so real. And I don't know if it's probably some of that 67, maybe use some room in there, more room in it, or even some digital stuff right now. At that time, there wasn't no really good digital reverb. So, man, it's in your face, but it's still, I don't know, it just sounds real. It sounds real to me. It's amazing.
I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it.